Cool. Well, welcome, Reed. So, Reed, you're a customer support specialist at Swan Bitcoin, and you also have a newsletter called BTC Buddha, right? Or Bitcoin Buddha.
Yeah, the Bitcoin Buddha. So I
Cool.
write a little bit about Bitcoin every week.
Nice. Do you practice Buddhism?
Yeah. So that's sort of my background. The last 5 or 6 years, I've been really into Buddhism.
Cool.
And that was actually sort of my previous obsession before I got into Bitcoin.
Gotcha.
So I still meditate for sure. But I used to go to a bunch of retreats, meditate many hours during the day. Now my meditation has decreased somewhat. Bitcoin consumption has increased.
Nice. Meditate on Bitcoin.
People ask me about that. I don't really think you can do it, or at least not the style of meditation I do.
Sure.
Bitcoin is a bit too conceptual.
Gotcha. So I guess just rolling off of that, what principles about Bitcoin kind of overlap with Buddhist principles?
Good question. They really are two very disparate fields that only occasionally have this overlap, and when they do, I get very excited and seeing the ways they speak to each other. But for the most part, they are two sort of totally different realms of knowledge and realms of reality, I've found. For the most part, like most Buddhist teachings don't really cover like market dynamics. They don't cover like how you should spend your time. They don't cover like business, and it really starts from this foundation. Buddhism starts from a foundation of like, you have these desires. How do you let go of the desires? And so that's just a totally different question than Bitcoin, which starts with the sort of Austrian economics foundation, which is you have these desires, you have these goals. How do you achieve those goals? And so it's just two completely different ways of looking at the world. One is actually trying to achieve goals. The other is like trying to let go of achieving goals altogether. And so as a result, they don't often overlap much. When they do, again, it's really exciting for me. But for the most part, day in, day out, I will just flip from one way of viewing the world to another way of viewing the world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is interesting how those are kind of polar opposites. I've been getting into a bit more Buddhist meditation recently. I'm gonna mispronounce her name, but Pema Chodron.
Tibetan nun who has a monastery in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the meditation, I think everybody's suffering from a bit of craziness right now. So a bit of being able to let go and detach and be in the present moment, skills that you can really develop with meditation, and then also having some hope for the future in Bitcoin for the financial system. I think it's a pretty good combo to have right now.
For sure. I think it's a good combination of skills and worldviews. And as sort of you mentioned, meditation much more focused on the present moment. Bitcoin, in a lot of ways, is much more gearing you towards planning for the future. Both, I think both are important, but if you get caught up, and both you need to balance both of them, because if you get caught up in either one, you're going to have a hard time thriving in life. If you live too much in the present, I've been on retreats where I just am like absurdly focused in the present, so much so that you like almost stop taking care of yourself. You're like, oh, these sensations of hunger, that's interesting. I'm just going to contemplate hunger for like 6 hours, and then you don't even eat. And then similarly, if you're always focused on the future, you never actually experience life because the future never arrives. You know, helpful to plan for occasionally, but you can never touch it. You can never experience it. It doesn't really exist. It's this conception. So if you just live always planning for the future, you're never gonna you're never gonna be happiness.
Sure. So how did you end up working at Swan Bitcoin?
Yeah, good question. So starting, I got really into Bitcoin about little under 2 years ago. So started getting into it in the fall of 2018, right as the price was crashing. And then through the winter, started reading a lot, and then number go up in spring of 2019 sucked me in deep. Became a Bitcoin maximalist beginning of last summer. And then, like everyone who that gets a certain distance down the rabbit hole, became overwhelmingly motivated to spread the gospel to like anyone who would listen. So I was trying to find ways to get my parents and my family on board. Contemplated just like, like leaving my wilderness therapy, going and living with, each family member for 2 weeks to have dinner with them every night and try and convince them to buy Bitcoin. Didn't end up doing that, but instead started a newsletter and was initially writing it every day. Sort of functioning to, I guess, threefold. One was for me to learn more about Bitcoin. I'm relatively new to the space. So it provided motivation for me to study and research. The second one was connect with family. Because, the more I got into Bitcoin, the more I realized the importance of family. And then the third was to try and actually convince some of my family to look into Bitcoin and start buying it. And so that was sort of the initial goals of the newsletter. It's changed a bit more recently as I opened it up to friends and then opened it up to random people. And now, most of the newsletters, people I don't personally know. And my parents are still on it. My friends are still on it, but vast majority are sort of people I've met through Twitter and people in the Bitcoin space. So it's no longer, or it's slightly more complex topics now that I deal with. It's, especially in the beginning, it was really just introducing the concepts to my family. But now it's sort of every week I write on something whatever I find interesting that week in Bitcoin. So, last week I wrote about Jan's book that he had just started giving away for free called Inventing Bitcoin. The week before was about the sovereign individual and sort of the end of the nation state. But I've, covered a wide range of things in Bitcoin.
Nice. Yeah, I'm currently going through the sovereign individual and I've been enjoying it quite a bit. It is a very interesting idea, and I look forward to starting my own citadel here pretty soon. But so what are for somebody that's new to what Bitcoin is, what are the most important concepts to understand? That's a big question.
Yeah. I think that I would just frame it as it's the most difficult money to make and to earn. And so therefore you want to own it. It requires the most energy and the most effort to produce. And therefore it's very, very difficult for it to, it's impossible for it to be inflated away. but framing it as this like very rare, very difficult to acquire good, I think is sort of my favorite way to introduce it to beginners. Is it's not something that's easy to get. It's not something that's easy to make, and that sort of gives it value. Aside from all of the cool things you can do with it, but the incentive structure makes it almost just impossible to produce. That's actually why I'm not a huge fan of like Bitcoin giveaways that some people do, because that's like just totally the wrong framework for how to think about Bitcoin. If you're like trying to introduce people to Bitcoin, really, like when I was first introducing people to Bitcoin, I was, I would try and like give people $10 of Bitcoin just to like get them looking at the price. But more and more, as of like a year ago, that just makes no sense to me, because you need to frame it to people as the most difficult to produce and the most difficult to acquire good in the world. And that, I think, will encourage them to buy it themselves.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I found that most people don't know how money works or where it comes from, and Bitcoin is usually that introduction for people to start asking those questions. Uh, and that's a really interesting way to frame Bitcoin as the hardest money to produce. For people that are just starting to question what Bitcoin is, there's warehouses full of computers specifically dedicated to compete to produce new blocks and earn Bitcoin rewards. So there's a ton of energy that goes into it. And I was actually, I'm going to talk with Dr. Chris Dark. He has an awesome podcast about how energy could be the future world reserve currency, which is a pretty interesting topic. But yeah, Bitcoin in a sense is representation of that energy of that is taken to produce it, and it just gets more and more difficult to produce over time. So yeah, I like that. That's a really good take on it, and not the usual take. It's usually fixed supply, which is important too. But yeah.
Yeah, that is absolutely important. But I mean, a lot of things at this point, a lot of altcoins have fixed supply now. And so to me, framing it that way is somewhat misleading, because if you look at any hard fork of Bitcoin, that hard fork also has a fixed supply. There's not going to be any more of, say, Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV than 21 million. And so you can't really argue that Bitcoin is the only supply cap thing in the world, or that its supply cap is what makes it particularly special compared to these other currencies. It's important for sure, and it's important compared to fiat, definitely, but there's more to it than just its supply capped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what swayed you from or what convinced you to become a Bitcoin maximalist?
It's a good question. It's a really good question. Because especially when you're new to cryptocurrencies and new to Bitcoin, you get into the space and you want to be as open-minded as possible. And in order to even get into looking at Bitcoin, you have to be open-minded. and then strangely enough, it seems as if a lot of the smartest people in the world are encouraging you to be incredibly open-minded by thinking about Bitcoin. But then once you start thinking about Bitcoin, they're incredibly or can be portrayed as being very close-minded and saying, don't even consider anything else. And for beginners, that can be a little confusing, right? Because you're used to operating in one worldview using dollars, and then you're asked to sort of open your worldview, consider another money, and consider another sort of political framework, an economic framework and paradigm to look through. And then once you're sort of coaxed along a little bit into this worldview, you're then told, don't consider all these other coins, don't consider all these other worldviews, stay within these bounds. And so a lot of people in cryptocurrency, if there is an industry in cryptocurrency, they can tease Bitcoin maximalists for this like strange paradox, right? Like, be open-minded enough to think about digital assets. Don't be open-minded enough by considering all these other alternative assets. I mean, and that from the outside, that's a pretty fair criticism. For me, at least, as I was starting to do research into the Bitcoin, I just routinely found that the smartest people were all Bitcoin and only Bitcoin. And their arguments against some of the alternative currencies were just stronger. And their worldviews were slightly more cohesive than the worldviews put out by people who are sort of endorsing other cryptocurrencies. And so that for me was sort of the kernel of like, what, the kernel question is like, why do the smartest people seem to all be coalescing around this one thing? And why don't I see that with some other communities that I was exposed to? And so from that question, sort of started doing research, like more and more research, and as I looked into a lot of the other cryptocurrencies, it just became increasingly clear that they were vastly different from Bitcoin, in that they weren't difficult to produce. They didn't have strong histories, didn't have strong communities, didn't always have a user base that could verify the rules of the system for themselves. A lot of the other cryptocurrency user bases rely a lot on trust, or sort of this like token leadership that they put all their faith in. Whereas in the Bitcoin community, there seemed to be this like ruthless independence that people had somehow like coalesced around. And so they weren't trusting a leader, or they weren't trusting, an organization or a company. The people who coalesced around Bitcoin were both really smart, but they were also like ruthlessly independent in like wanting to verify everything for themselves. And so those are sort of like the social explanation of how I got into Bitcoin and became a Bitcoin maximalist. I mean, the economic explanation is that sort of goes back to Mises' idea that all monies tend towards one. Money is a very different good than most consumer goods, in that with most consumer goods, the market is stronger and better if you have more options. So it's better for the world if we have 10 different car companies than if we just have one car company. And money is a very strange good in that that's not actually the case. It's like much easier and better for the world to have one money than to have a fractured system of fiat monies, or a fractured system of cryptocurrencies. So from like the worldview perspective, it's better to just have one currency. And from the individual perspective, where everything really starts and how you build up to that worldview is if you're an individual, you do not want to make multiple trades to get to the good you want. You want to make as few of trades as possible to get from what you have to the goal that you have in mind. And if you have to trade through multiple monies, that's just an inefficiency, and that's friction. And so typically you'll trade your labor for money, and then you'll trade your money for the good or service that you want. And the more times you have to switch into alternative currencies or alternative goods, like the more of a hassle it is, and the more you're likely to lose a little bit in slippage. And so individuals will naturally just try and find the most saleable good. For many years that was gold, and then gold had some issues. Gold has some issues. It's really heavy. It's not really that divisible, and so people wanted an easier way to trade. And paper money had a lot of actually advantages over gold. It was much easier to divide into smaller parts. It was also much easier to trade massive volumes over a distance and do that relatively quickly. And so then paper money became the most saleable good. And so to my thesis and a lot of Bitcoin maximalist thesis is that Bitcoin is now going to turn into the most saleable good. And the market will slowly realize that Bitcoin is much more saleable, much easier to move around, and has better protections than fiat money, than paper money.
Yeah, that's an awesome explanation. A lot of these altcoins try to market themselves as money, and they're not necessarily focused on money. But yeah, for the new person coming in, they're probably going to be on like crypto YouTube or crypto Twitter and be getting all these. I find that one of the biggest drivers into cryptocurrency is the search for easy money.
Sure. Yeah, that draws in probably 90% of the people.
Yep.
Of people, like people who didn't come in as previously Austrian, or previously Austrian economics people, or previously like in libertarian, deeply libertarian folks. 90% of the people that are coming in think that Bitcoin will make them money really, really fast, and so it's these like price pumps that'll suck people in. But then over time, they'll sort of realize like, oh, it's actually not. The reason I got in was for easy money, but the reason they stay is for hard money. When they realize that Bitcoin is incredibly difficult to make.
Yeah, and to realize it's incredibly difficult to make, it's always a good experiment to try and get out there and start mining on your laptop or something like that, just to realize how.
For anyone listening, do not try and mine from your laptop. You're gonna lose a lot of money if you try and do that, or lose a little bit of money and not make very much Bitcoin.
It's gonna be a waste of time.
Yeah, a year and a half ago, when I first got into, or for a year and a half ago, I had that idea. I was like, oh, I should just mine from my laptop, and I like downloaded some program I think called Honey Miner. Started trying to mine, and it was like making me like 1 cent every like 2 months or something, and simultaneously using my laptop is running very hot. It's like impossible to do other things on my laptop. And then actually later realized that I think that whole program is just like malware. So don't use Honey Miner. Don't try and mine from your laptop.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest it either. You'll just fry your laptop. Now running a node is different. That might be a good experiment for somebody new to download like the BTC Core node. I found that pretty fun. But yeah, there's so many of those different programs that promise. I remember there was like a Google Chrome browser that supposedly mined, and waste of money, waste of time. But
and again, 99% of cloud mining is also a scam. So if anyone contacts you saying like, send me Bitcoin or send me money and I'll mine for you, don't do it. You're much better off just buying Bitcoin yourself than sending money to some online internet stranger with the promise that they'll give you more Bitcoin in the future.
Yeah, don't send your Bitcoin to Elon Musk either.
Yeah, exactly.
Or whatever these crypto scams on YouTube. But yeah. So yeah, maximalism is something I really appreciate, and I think it's something that keeps people clear of getting into a lot of trouble. Typically, if you're going to invest in altcoins, you're not investing in money, you're investing in a technology or like a utility service, in my opinion. And that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even really think of them as technologies or utility services. It's really just gambling. Because ultimately they're all competing against Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is just going to wreck every single other utility token. And it may possibly be that some sorts of like equity offerings, the nature of equity offerings changes. And so that maybe the New York Stock Exchange may not be the only place you can sort of buy a stake in a public company. That may happen. I'm not going to say that it's it's going to happen on the blockchain, but even if sort of these other assets are the nature of ownership of those changes, they're still competing against the most profound monetary technology in 10,000 years. And so there's still just so much more risk associated with other digital assets than with Bitcoin. You have, yeah, you just have so much more risk if you decide to gamble on these other altcoins. You have, yeah, oh my God, yeah. So I don't touch them personally. Like I understand if people want to try and make money gambling essentially and trying to get in and out of altcoins, and they're not going to go away. It's not like in the next 10 years Bitcoin is or all other cryptocurrencies are going to cease to exist. But they will continue to just have these like crazy pump and dumps, I think, for 10, 20, 30, 50 years, essentially until central banking really falls and until society has moved towards a predominantly low time preference culture in which people are no longer interested in gambling and no longer really can conceptualize like scamming people and making a quick buck. That's and central banking is like a thing of the past. That's when I think you'll really see altcoins fade away. In the meantime, there's going to be a new one every few months, a new pump and dump, and chances are, if you try and pursue it, you're going to lose. You're going to guess wrong.
Yeah.
That's not to say that there won't be ones that'll go up 1,000%, and you could sell it at the top. But most likely you're going to buy it up at 1,000% and then it's going to crash down to zero. So most people who trade lose money. In traditional markets, it's like 95%. In crypto markets, it's 99%. So unless you are a professional trader by day, you probably don't want to spend your nights trading or investing in altcoins. And you're much better off just sort of setting aside a little bit of your earnings into Bitcoin every day, every week, every month, and sort of trying to steer clear of the altcoins.
Yeah, that's some good advice. And if anybody's listening and pushing back against that, it'd be good to go watch Dave Portnoy and his reaction to all of the money he lost in Chainlink recently. But yeah, I got into Bitcoin about the same time you did, and when I came in, Litecoin was touted as like the silver to Bitcoin's gold, and now it's just like a dead project, pretty much, from what I can tell.
Yeah. That's the other thing. The longer you're in, the more you see these. The more you see the life cycle of altcoins and how each month there's sort of a new one that's touted, promoted, and then it goes on a run for a few months, and then it sort of fades away. People just sort of stop talking about it, stop saying anything about it as the chart drops to zero. And then there's a new one touted and sort of new jargon, new lingo, new claims that this new blockchain, this new coin can do things that the other one can't do, or fills this important niche that we've always needed. And the more you see these cycles, the more you sort of realize that there's nothing really new under the sun in terms of cryptocurrencies. That maybe the the original was onto something, and it still keeps doing exactly what it's doing. Like, hasn't failed, 99.9% uptime, and it keeps delivering on its promises. Whereas, some of these other coins, they'll seem like they're going somewhere for a few months and then crash and burn.
Yeah, I got a real kick out of watching some of crypto Twitter freak out about XRP, realizing that XRP is a scam this week, and that was pretty funny.
Oh yeah, I'm not really actually in crypto Twitter. With a narrower niche of Bitcoin Twitter, and so that went totally over my head. I mean, I realized that, very long time ago, that XRP is a total scam.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that so many people have been lost so much money on a project like that.
Was as an aside, was like, did Crypto Bitlord have something to do with revealing to everyone that XRP is a scam? Like why are people just waking up to this now?
Yeah, I think it was him in particular that was freaking out, and I unfollowed him because I was kind of on the same path as you, of realizing a lot of this is just like a waste of energy and time to be
Totally.
People getting scammed by these stupid projects. But oh man, yeah. All right, we got two toxic maximalists together talking. I'm just kidding. So yeah, I mean, you were talking a little bit earlier about how libertarians, which tend to have a view of an economic view of Austrian school of thought. Where I'm trying to come and show people is that that mindset is actually going to be the best to create a fair and equitable society, and will be most successful in addressing issues of like poverty and extreme wealth and unfair extreme wealth inequality. Do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, it's a good question, because I initially pretty convinced that Bitcoin would fix the rising inequality we see in the world, and that rising inequality, in my view, is the cause of a lot of the social unrest that we see, and sort of the increasingly partisan politics, the divisiveness, and sort of the social, like the fraying of the social fabric that sort of feels to be happening now, compared to, say, if you look back at like the 1950s or the 1910s. Like, you didn't have that sort of feeling of the social fabric fraying and then this massive inequality in wealth, and thought that Bitcoin in a lot of ways would solve that. And I think there's a compelling case to be made that it could, that essentially fiat money disproportionately targets poor people and disproportionately takes their savings. And wealthy people are able to move their savings into assets that are scarce, and those assets are protected against inflation. Whereas poor people, because they need the liquidity, they simply can't buy houses or buy stocks or buy gold. They need to have that money under their mattress or in their savings account in order to survive, because they never know when they may need that $500 to pay for an emergency room visit or something. And so fiat disproportionately targets poor people, for sure. And I think if you look at the great website WTF happened in 1971, you'll see that in a lot of ways, like since 1971, when fiat really took off and we detached from the gold standard, inequality has been rising, for sure. And that's sort of the dominant narrative within the Bitcoin community, or a dominant narrative in the Bitcoin community, is that Bitcoin will help fix some of wealth inequality. That said, the Austrian view and sort of the radical self-sovereignty of Bitcoin likely means that anyone who, or it leads to pure meritocracy, really, and would lead to a pure meritocracy economy in which there's really not that many large social safety nets provided by the state. And so, like right now, we have massive welfare programs. You have a lot of subsidy for poverty in various areas, and under a Bitcoin standard, that would effectively go away. That it would be increasingly difficult for governments to fund and subsidy those types of programs, and so people would increasingly have to rely on themselves, their family, and their tight social networks for that sort of support. That said, I personally think that would actually lead to improved life outcomes rather than sort of reduced life outcomes. That sort of encouraging people to be more self-sufficient, rely on themselves and their families is a much more functional way to build a society than having these massive social welfare programs that are incredibly bureaucratic. There's a lot more waste there. And you're much better off essentially seeking support from the people closest to you than seeking support from some massive state. So that's been my thinking for the last year. As I read the sort of Sovereign Individual, though, that book has a slightly different take in arguing, and I'm not fully convinced of this, but it is a reasonable idea to consider that with the rise of sort of digital stores of wealth, people will be able to move their money into the digital realm, and a lot of the low level jobs will be automated, and so increasingly, like investors, inventors, coders, people who are really savvy, tech savvy, will be able to produce an enormous amount of value, and people who are sort of like the day laborers, that is going to be increasingly less valuable, because those sorts of hard goods are, well, they're digital goods have far more value than hard goods increasingly, because digital goods you can send anywhere in the world. It's incredibly easy to protect them with encryption from confiscation from the government or from your peers, whereas physical goods require a lot more security. And so if you're just like building a house, that's going to get taxed more. Whereas if you're just taking all that value and storing in Bitcoin, that's not going to get taxed. And so all of the people who are sort of doing these physical roles and building the physical world, those jobs and that value is going to be far, far less than what you can earn in the digital world. And so the Sovereign Individual suggests, like, you may actually see even greater disparity in wealth, and because you'll have these people who have the skills to produce digital content, code new websites, build businesses that aren't located physically anywhere but are located, can operate from anywhere, and then the people who are the construction workers, those sorts of goods are not going to be as valuable, and so they're not going to make as much. In some ways, that's a compelling framework. I think in other ways, though, like the Austrian view of that argument would be that individuals will naturally just move toward providing the service that pays them the most, and if that means construction workers will end up being transcribers, then so be it. And people will move from sort of producing more physical goods to producing more digital goods, and they'll make that transition for themselves. So it's not like these construction workers or people who are building, like working in factories now, will be unable to make that switch into a more digital world. So anyway, that sorry to bring up two ideas there. One is the idea that Bitcoin will fix all wealth inequality, and the second one is like, nah, it's actually going to be a pure meritocracy, and there are some reasons that people who will thrive in the digital realm will be able to corner and produce more value than ever before, even.
Yeah, so wow, that's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I think Bitcoin is a good frame. I had the guys, Colin and Ben, on from the WTF happened in 1971, and they're really awesome. And one of the things that they said is, you were talking about unrest in society, and if things were economically good in our society, people would have better things to do than to go protest, and be really angry. They'd probably be content. But instead, things are so bad that we're um, uh, facing a huge eviction crisis, and people can't afford food, and that's really real in Tucson. In 2017, we had a quarter of the city living under the poverty line, which is like a really, really small number. So for one person, the federal poverty line is like $12,000 a year, which is just not, I don't know how you could live off of that, even in Tucson with like a really low cost of living. And so Bitcoin, kind of what you were talking about as far as being the hardest money to make, you don't, it makes it more fair for people, because there's not like a money printer just endlessly issuing it. And the closer you are to the money printer, the more advantage you have over others. And when you say meritocracy, you mean, your value, or success in society is depending on, the value that you can produce, instead of necessarily like uh, being a corrupt official that somehow gains power, or having access to a money printer, and being a bank and having unfair advantages over others.
Yeah, essentially using violence to extract wealth from people, or lie or misleading them in order to extract wealth from people, versus meritocracy is, people are able to defend themselves very well from extortion and theft. And so in order to take their money, it has to be much more consensual. And so you have to provide a good or service that they actually want, rather than essentially being able to strong arm your way into their pockets, which has sort of been the modus operandi of the 20th century. And now we finally have the ways to protect ourselves digitally from theft much more easily. That that I think going forward, you'll be able to defend yourself pretty well. And so if someone wants to make money, the options, it's less easy for them to go into sort of the career of force or the career of extortion, and that's just less enticing, and so they'll sort of be forced to go into entrepreneurship and business, and that makes people's lives better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about digital goods having more value than physical goods. I want to circle back to something that you were talking about in regards to if and when Bitcoin becomes like the dominant currency of the world, governments have less power to have or fund social programs. I think a lot of people would find that really problematic, first hearing it. What I think is missing from that conversation is oftentimes, our politicians come in, they present these social programs as a fix to problems that they created. It's not addressing the root issue. Which is a lot of time, a lot of it has to do with money. So you referenced 1971 and coming off the gold standard and inequality being created since then. If there weren't these issues, like if insurance was actually affordable and healthcare was affordable because the money was sound and they couldn't get away with jacking up the prices, and there were actually competitive markets, and there weren't these kind of monopolistic systems, we wouldn't need the extent of the social programs. Is that kind of what you were referring to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you ever, or that government should ever really provide large social programs. And so even if like healthcare were expensive, or or housing were expensive in a lot of ways. So for housing, as an example, the housing is expensive because the money is garbage. I think healthcare is fairly expensive in the U.S. because it's not a free and open market. That there's a lot of coercion in the healthcare industry, and government has its hands on it a lot, and as a result, the prices are very high. And so the more you can extract government from the healthcare industry, the less expensive the prices would be. But yeah, so even if you have some of these social problems, the answer is unfortunately not the government getting involved and trying to fix it, because in a lot of ways they end up creating these weird moral hazards that end up subsidizing the exact thing that they wish to end. And that doesn't happen as much with private charities and private organizations, because they have a much better sense of individuals. And so if you can, if this may be a strange way to explain this, but with private charities and institutions, they don't have an infinite money, and so they need to be very thoughtful about how they allocate those resources. And so they're unlikely to simply give somebody like a pension forever, or give somebody money forever. And so if you look at the history of private organizations, a lot of like church charities, they're very good at like when somebody has a moment of weakness, they'll step in, they'll provide support, and then they'll take the support away so that person can be independent again. And as soon as you build up this big bureaucracy of a welfare state, that goes away. And so that there's not this sort of like thoughtful, kind, and compassionate sort of removal of the supports so that people can be independent again. And increasingly, people just become more and more dependent upon the support from the government. And so, like people in small church charities, your house burns down, great, people come, they give you a place to live temporarily, they'll donate some money, they'll build your house up, and then they'll step back, and like you will no longer be like on the dole of the church. Whereas in the welfare state, your house burns down, they don't fix your house, they just give you $1,000 a month, and then there's no timeline to sort of reasonably remove that. And so you end up becoming increasingly dependent on that $1,000 a month, because there's no like compassionate personal relationships to be able to gauge like, okay, this is an appropriate amount of support. Okay, now that you're more independent, we'll take a little bit away. Okay, now you're more independent, we'll take a little bit away. And private charities are very good at having this end goal of like, we want our citizens, who may be helped now, to ultimately be independent and fully functioning and able to contribute to society. And sure, government welfare programs actually are the exact opposite. Like, that's not their goal. Their goal is to create as many essentially employees of the welfare system as possible. So they try and expand it as much as possible, because those become sort of this voting block that you can then manipulate towards expanding the state even more. So just private charities work very well towards solving these social issues, and these welfare states and large government programs do not. And so when libertarians or Bitcoiners or people talk about, moving away from the welfare state, the goal is not to eliminate welfare altogether. It's simply to change the organization that's providing it from the state, which we don't think is a particularly helpful or useful or good organization to provide it, toward these private charities and private organizations like churches. or, if you're not religious, I'm not Christian, I'm a Buddhist, but like, some sort of private organization that's smaller scale can provide the exact same services much more effectively than the federal government.
Sure. Yeah, I think just historically, the church organizations have been the institutions, but there could be secular organizations that form as well. And there are. Yeah, there definitely are. Yeah, there's the and I think that's something that's really powerful too, when you use sound money and you attain financial freedom, and you're not just having your wealth completely stolen from you through inflation consistently, you have the ability to give money and really be helpful to your community, and to give to these private organizations. Like, I think I would do a much better job, and I think I do a much better job if I wasn't constantly being taxed to take my money and better my community, than what the government does with it in funding these social programs. And I think a lot of people would as well. I mean, there's always the argument against that people are greedy, but
they certainly are greedy. But I think even if, so like, imagine we got rid of taxes, and even if, and I actually don't think that you would see a massive increase in people, like as a result of earning all this money, they become more philanthropic. I don't really imagine that happening. But those people still would invest that money into their local communities. So perhaps they would, they personally want a bike park for themselves, and so they would invest in a bike park in their local community. And while that may not be purely philanthropic because it's serving them, that still would be contributing to the community. Similarly, like maybe they would decide to buy a little bit fancier food at the grocery store, and while that's not incredibly philanthropic, that puts more money back to the grocery store.
Yeah, there'd be less demand for generic products. Yeah, that's an interesting take. Yeah, probably more support for small businesses, and then wow, well, interesting conversation. I know you gotta go here pretty soon, so wrapping up, what's really bringing hope to you right now during this insane time?
Good question.
Are you really excited for a particular political candidate to solve all your issues?
No, not excited for that. I think one of the cool things about my journey into Bitcoin is it's increasingly sort of narrowed my focus in my life toward the people directly around me and toward my life. And so I'm just less and less concerned with sort of national drama playing out, international drama playing out, and more concerned with my health, my relationships, my parents, my girlfriend, my job. And so like this past year has strangely, actually, I know this is unusual for to say, but it has been one of the best years of my life. And so I'm excited to keep working, for a company I really like, keep meditating, and keep growing my personal relationship with my girlfriend. So yeah, and keep spending time outside.
Yeah. Awesome. So you've been on some other podcasts too. So if you search Reed Wommack on YouTube, you'll pop up. Where are some other places people can find your work and what you're doing?
Absolutely. The best place to get in touch with me is on Twitter. My handle is Reed Wommack, ReedWommack. I've done a little bit of writing on Medium too, about scarcity, actually, meditation. So the Buddhism and Bitcoin scarcity I've written about. And then if you want to sign up to start saving in Bitcoin, the best place to do that is Swan Bitcoin. And you can sign up and get $10 free of Bitcoin. Don't let that confuse you. Bitcoin is actually very hard to get. So don't let the giveaway confuse you. But yeah, if you sign up at swanbitcoin.com/readwommack, you can get $10 free and set an account up and start saving $5-10 a month. Or, you know, if you want to save a lot more, you can. And it's just so it's the easiest and safest way to start buying Bitcoin. We make it very beginner friendly. So check it out. And otherwise, yeah, thank you for having me on. This was really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And for people that are listening, $10 a week is one meal. It's like, I like to say it's like one burrito. So if you're willing to sacrifice one burrito, you can get $10 a week of Bitcoin, which is $40 a month, which adds up over time. And yeah, check out Swan Bitcoin. Do you have like a promo code?
Yeah, that was it. It was swanbitcoin.com/readwommack. That's the promo
/readwommack.
code.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
If you sign up at Swan Bitcoin, you won't get $10 free. So, but if
so you have to use,
you have to use that /, then you do.
There you go.
/readwommack.
The slash for the $10. All righty. Well, thanks for coming on, Reed.